Across the earth, the pictorial record which the world had seen of German death camps would not be readily forgotten either.
This is the moment the first Allied soldiers discovered the Nazi concentration camps. Men of the Soviet 60th Army, Allied soldiers of the Eastern Front, pushed up to a set of barbed wire gates stamped with a lie. They expected a prison. They stepped into a machine built for erasing human beings. Passing through the gates of Auschwitz, they entered a world no battlefield had prepared them for. About 7,000 survivors, many too weak to stand, waited surrounded by over 600 unburied corpses. In nearby warehouses, troops found hundreds of thousands of garments, 370,000 men's suits, 37,000 women's articles of clothing, around 7 tons of human hair, and mountains of eyeglasses from people who would never see again. Faces pressed against barrack windows as the soldiers tried to make sense of it all. What unfolded across Europe in 1944 and 1945 was a cascade of revelations. From Poland to Bavaria, Soviet, American, British, and Canadian troops stumbled upon a network that defied prior imagination. These were not POW cages or ad hoc prisons. They were state-engineered killing systems. In this documentary, we chronicle the moment when the Allies first pulled back the curtain on the Holocaust, and how these discoveries changed everything about how the world would remember this war. The Soviet discovery of the concentration camps came first, and it came through the lens of an army that had already witnessed the most catastrophic bloodshed on the Eastern Front. The Red Army had been pushing westward throughout 1944, and with each mile gained, the landscape of human suffering became increasingly visible. The soldiers were not fighting in isolation anymore. They were liberating territory that the Nazis had occupied for years, and with that territory came the awful knowledge that atrocities had been committed beyond the scope of what was happening on the front lines. In July 1944, as Soviet forces pushed toward the city of Lublin in Poland, they encountered Majdanek. This was no surprise camp hidden deep in a forest. Majdanek sat on the outskirts of a major city, a sprawling complex of barracks and buildings that the local population had watched operate for years. What the Soviets found was a death camp in its most raw and exposed form. There were gas chambers, crematoria, and the remains of thousands of executed prisoners. Perhaps most shockingly, because the Nazis had been evacuating the camp hastily, much of the evidence was still intact. The Soviets discovered bodies, execution sites, and documentation of systematic murder. But here was the crucial difference between the Soviet discoveries and those that would later come in the West. The Soviets were advancing in an area that had already been devastated by total war. They had already seen the ruins of cities razed to the ground. They had already counted hundreds of thousands of their own soldiers dead in the mud and snow. When Soviet soldiers entered Majdanek, their officers recognized immediately that this was something different from the horrors of combat. This was something calculated, industrial, and incomprehensibly evil. Throughout the summer of 1944, Soviet forces liberated camp after camp across Poland and the Baltics. They entered Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, 3 of the most notorious death camps of the Nazi system. Yet here was a peculiar and tragic irony. The camps they discovered first were the ones that had been explicitly designed to leave no witnesses. Treblinka, in particular, had been almost completely dismantled by the Nazis as the Soviet advance approached. The killing chambers had been demolished, the crematoria destroyed, the mass graves exhumed and burned to remove evidence. What the Soviets found at Treblinka was not a functioning death camp, but an erasure, a landscape of ash and destruction where the Nazis had tried to erase the evidence of 800,000 murders. Soviet soldiers walked through empty fields where a genocidal machine had operated. They found scattered bones and ash, but the full horror of what had happened could only be understood through the accounts of a handful of survivors who had managed to escape. This posed an immediate problem. The Soviet discoveries were happening in territories that were far from Allied supply lines, far from the Western press, and in areas where the Soviet Union had its own strategic interests. Stalin's government was not inclined to publicize these discoveries to the world. In fact, the Soviet narratives about the camps would be deliberately shaped to emphasize Soviet suffering and Soviet victory rather than the specific targeting of Jews and other groups. The camps would be presented as monuments to Nazi barbarism, but not as evidence of a systematic attempt to exterminate an entire people. The full horror of the Soviet discoveries would be overshadowed by what came next, the Western liberations that would bring American and British soldiers into direct contact with camps that were still operating, still filled with prisoners, and still bearing the unmistakable machinery of death. But the Soviet soldiers who entered those first camps had already seen something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They had seen what industrial-scale cruelty looked like. They had seen what lay at the end of the Nazi regime's obsession with total control and total annihilation. When American soldiers of the 11th Armored Division approached Mauthausen concentration camp on May 5, 1945, they were not seeking a discovery. They were pursuing a military objective. The war in Europe was winding down. Germany was on the verge of surrender. Victory was in sight, and soldiers were eager to move forward toward the final conquest of Nazi Germany. Instead, what they found was something that halted them in their tracks. Mauthausen was one of the largest concentration camps in the Nazi system, and it was built on a hill overlooking a quarry. The most famous and most horrifying aspect of Mauthausen was what prisoners called the Stairs of Death, a long stone staircase leading down into a quarry. Prisoners too weak to continue working were forced to carry massive blocks of stone up these stairs. When they could no longer climb, the SS guards simply pushed them off the edge. Hundreds of prisoners fell to their deaths this way, their bodies accumulating in the quarry below until they were hauled away and cremated. When American soldiers entered the camp, they encountered something that no briefing, no intelligence report, no photograph could have adequately prepared them for. They found a landscape of human degradation on a scale that defied comprehension. Barracks overflowing with skeletal prisoners, many of them barely alive, crematory ovens still warm, evidence of systematic execution everywhere. One American soldier, who had fought across Europe from D-Day onward, later said that entering Mauthausen was the most horrifying thing he had witnessed in the entire war. Worse than any battlefield, worse than any urban combat, worse than any artillery barrage. On that same day, soldiers of the American 71st Infantry Division, approaching from a different direction, discovered Gunskirchen Lager, a satellite camp of Mauthausen. Here, conditions were even more appalling. The Nazis had forced thousands of prisoners on death marches away from the advancing Americans, and those who were too weak to march had been abandoned in this overcrowded camp with no food, no water, and no medical care. When American soldiers arrived, they found thousands of corpses piled in mass graves, and thousands more prisoners still alive but in the most desperate condition imaginable. The soldiers' first instinct was to help. They began distributing what food and water they had. They created makeshift medical stations. They carried prisoners who could not walk to safer areas of the camp. Some soldiers gave prisoners their own blankets. Others sat with the dying, providing what comfort they could in those final moments. These acts of kindness, repeated thousands of times across multiple camps, represented a stark and moral contrast to the systematic cruelty that had come before. The psychological impact on these soldiers was immediate and profound. Many of them were teenagers, young men who had been drafted or volunteered just a few years earlier to fight a war they had been told was about stopping fascism and defending democracy. They had been trained to kill, to survive combat, to follow orders, but nothing had trained them for this. The soldiers found themselves weeping. Some of them became violently ill. Others stood in stunned silence, unable to process what their eyes were seeing. The discovery forced a reckoning with the nature of the enemy they were fighting. This was not a war between opposing armies with different ideologies. This was a war between a civilization that had rules, however imperfect, and a regime that had deliberately, systematically, and with cold calculation, built a system designed to murder people on an industrial scale. The Nazi regime had not just fought a war, it had tried to destroy an entire people, and it had come terrifyingly close to succeeding. The soldiers began documenting what they found. Photographs were taken. Accounts were recorded. The International Red Cross was called in to help with the surviving prisoners. But the soldiers also did something else. Despite their shock and their horror, despite having fought across Europe and being hardened by years of combat, these young men responded with spontaneous compassion. They shared their rations with prisoners who were starving. They gave prisoners water and medical supplies. They held the hands of men and women who were dying. One soldier, seeing a prisoner so weak he could barely stand, removed his own coat and wrapped it around the prisoner's shoulders. Another soldier sat with a survivor who was weeping, unable to speak, just holding him as he processed the loss of his entire family. These moments were not documented in official reports or military records. They were simply the human response of soldiers confronted with human suffering on an incomprehensible scale. And slowly, the word began to spread through the American forces in Europe that something even worse than the war itself had been uncovered. Officers who had never seen the camps began hearing reports from soldiers who had. Commanders struggled to understand how to react to these discoveries and how to respond to soldiers who were traumatized by what they had witnessed. Medical teams were organized. Supply lines were diverted to bring food and medicine to the camps. Yet even as news spread among the American forces, the scale of what was being discovered was still not fully understood. More camps were being found every day. Each discovery seemed to reveal new horrors, new evidence of Nazi depravity, new chambers designed to kill human beings with mechanical efficiency. On April 11, 1945, American forces of the 80th Infantry Division, advancing eastward toward the German heartland, encountered Buchenwald concentration camp near the city of Weimar. What they found was not just a camp. It was a massive complex that had been operating since 1937. Buchenwald was one of the oldest concentration camps in Nazi Germany, and it had been used as a proving ground for many of the systems of control, brutality, and dehumanization that would later be refined and extended throughout the camp network. The camp held thousands of prisoners, many of them political prisoners from across occupied Europe. There were also Soviet prisoners of war, who had been subjected to particularly brutal treatment. There were men and there were survivors from Buchenwald who had been working as part of the camp infrastructure. Prisoners themselves, but given positions of minor authority as a way of dividing the camp population and preventing unified resistance. As American soldiers passed through the gates, they encountered a situation that was both more organized and more chaotic than what they had found at other camps. Just days before the American arrival, prisoners had seized control of the camp in a desperate last act of resistance. The SS guards had retreated as American forces approached, and the prisoners themselves had taken over the administration of the camp. There were still thousands of prisoners alive, though tens of thousands had died over the years or had been evacuated or murdered as the Nazis attempted to cover up their crimes. American soldiers encountered prisoners who could barely walk, who were covered in lice and disease, who had been starved to the point of being unrecognizable as human beings. But the prisoners greeted the Americans not with gratitude, but with urgent pleas. They pointed to mass graves. They showed soldiers where prisoners had been executed. They led American forces to buildings that had been used as experimental laboratories, where Nazi doctors had conducted horrific medical experiments on prisoners without anesthesia, without consent, with no regard whatsoever for human suffering. The soldiers listened carefully to these accounts. They took prisoners' testimony seriously. They documented what they were being shown. And they made a commitment to help these survivors, to ensure their stories were told, and to ensure that those responsible would be held accountable. American medics worked through the night, providing what care they could to the sick and injured prisoners. Soldiers donated their own rations to prisoners who were starving. One American officer organized a search of the camp for any remaining supplies that could be used to help the prisoners survive their first days of freedom. One American officer, Andrew Kinnery, was later asked what it was like to enter Buchenwald. His response was simple and direct. You couldn't grasp it all. These 4 words capture something essential about the experience of liberation. The camps were simply too large, too complex, too overwhelming for a single soldier or a single officer to fully comprehend. The scale of death was incomprehensible. The infrastructure of murder was everywhere, in the barracks, in the crematory, in the detailed records the Nazis kept, in the mountains of evidence they had not had time to destroy. At Buchenwald, American soldiers found documents, meticulous Nazi documents, that detailed the murder of prisoners. They found photographs, they found records of medical experiments. They found a catalogue of human cruelty that suggested this was not the result of passion or the chaos of war, but a carefully calculated system designed to inflict maximum suffering and death. The American soldiers who entered Buchenwald also encountered a sight that would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives. The crematory. The ovens were still warm. Ashes still lay on the floor. The Nazis had been murdering prisoners right up until the very moment the camp was liberated. The ovens at Buchenwald had operated continuously for 8 years, cremating the remains of prisoners who had been worked to death, starved to death, or executed outright. The soldiers understood immediately that they were not just witnessing the remnants of brutality, they were witnessing evidence of ongoing, systematic mass murder. And they realized that if the American advance had been delayed by even a few weeks, thousands more prisoners might have been murdered before liberation could have arrived. The psychological burden on these soldiers was immense. Many of them struggled with what they had seen, and many of them struggled with the knowledge that they had arrived just in time, but only just barely in time. The question haunted them: how many had died in the months and years before they arrived? Dachau holds a unique place in the history of Nazi concentration camps. It was the first camp established by the Nazis after they came to power in 1933. It was originally conceived as a facility to hold political prisoners, communists, socialists, trade unionists, and anyone else the Nazi regime deemed a threat to its power. For years, Dachau was considered a model camp, carefully controlled, orderly, with a hierarchy and a system. But as the war progressed and as the Nazi regime's ambitions expanded, Dachau was transformed into something far more sinister. It became a center for medical experimentation, a holding facility for prisoners destined for murder camps elsewhere, and a training ground for the SS guards who would oversee the entire camp system. By the time American forces of the 42nd Infantry Division approached Dachau on April 29, 1945, the camp had become a warehouse of death. Thousands of prisoners from all over Nazi-occupied Europe had been forced on death marches toward Dachau as the Nazis attempted to evacuate the camps ahead of the advancing Americans. The prisoners were weak, starving, and many of them were dying. They traveled in freight cars, sealed boxcars with no food, no water, no sanitation. Hundreds died during these death marches, their bodies either dumped along the rail lines or left to rot in the cars. When American soldiers arrived at the rail yards outside Dachau, they encountered a sight that seemed to come directly from hell itself. There were trains filled with corpses, thousands of dead bodies twisted in positions that suggested they had died in unimaginable agony. The surviving prisoners on these trains were in such horrific condition that many of them could barely be moved. They had to be carefully extracted from the cars, and many of them died despite the best efforts of the American soldiers to save them. One American soldier who arrived at Dachau on that day later recalled what he saw. "We weren't supposed to be shocked by anything after what we'd already seen in the war, but this was different. This was deliberate. This was done with intention, and there were still SS guards there, people who had been murdering other human beings literally minutes before we arrived. Some of the guards were shot on sight. I don't think anyone blamed the men who did it." The liberation of Dachau was marred by the spontaneous execution of remaining SS guards by American soldiers who were overcome with rage at what they had discovered. This execution of prisoners and guards happened on the spot, without trial, without judgment, simply in response to witnessing the evidence of unspeakable cruelty. It was one of the few instances during the war where the veneer of military discipline and order was stripped away entirely in the face of what had been discovered. Inside Dachau itself, American soldiers encountered conditions that rivaled the worst of any camp they had found. Barracks overcrowded with skeletal prisoners, many of them suffering from typhus and other diseases. A crematory in full operation. Evidence of medical experiments on prisoners. mass graves with thousands of corpses. With approximately 30,000 starving prisoners in the camp, the American soldiers faced an immediate humanitarian crisis. What happened next revealed the deeper character of these men. Despite being soldiers in an active war zone, despite having witnessed atrocities that defied comprehension, these young Americans responded with compassion. They began feeding the prisoners. They provided water and medical care. They worked to disinfect survivors and provide basic hygiene. They held dying prisoners. They listened to the stories of survivors. They treated the prisoners not as defeated enemies or as witnesses to interrogate, but as human beings who had been subjected to unimaginable cruelty and who now needed help, comfort, and dignity. The soldiers' actions were not coordinated from above or mandated by officers. They were spontaneous expressions of humanity. Young men who understood that they had a responsibility not just to defeat the enemy, but to help restore the humanity that the enemy had tried to destroy. The American soldiers realized that Dachau was not unique. It was not an anomaly or an exception. It was the template, the first camp that had shown the Nazi regime what was possible, the proof of concept for the entire system of concentrations and death camps that would follow. Dachau had been operating for 12 years. For 12 years, the world had known about it. There had been reports, there had been warnings, there had been evidence, and for 12 years it had continued to function, to expand, to refine its methods of killing. As American soldiers catalogued what they found at Dachau, they began to understand that the concentration camp system was not a secret that had been hidden from the world. It was a secret that the world had known about but had chosen to ignore. On April 15, 1945, British forces entered Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in northern Germany. If the American discoveries had been shocking, what the British encountered was in many ways even more horrifying, because the camp was still operating, still filled with thousands of dying prisoners, and still bearing all the machinery of the Nazi system. Bergen-Belsen had been established in 1943 as a camp for prisoners who were being held for exchange or who were too sick to work in the labor camps. But by the time the British arrived, it had become a hell on earth. The camp was overcrowded far beyond capacity, with thousands of prisoners packed into barracks designed for a fraction of that number. Disease was rampant. Typhus had swept through the camp like a plague. Prisoners were dying by the hundreds every single day, not from execution, but from starvation, disease, and the complete absence of any medical care or sanitation. British soldiers entered the camp and were immediately confronted with scenes that defied all previous understanding of human suffering. They found mass graves, thousands of corpses piled into pits. They found prisoners too weak to even stand, lying on the ground surrounded by filth and disease. But perhaps most shockingly, they found that many of the dying prisoners were almost beyond saving. The medical teams that arrived with the British forces struggled to provide basic care. Many of the prisoners were so far gone that they died even after liberation, their bodies simply too damaged by years of starvation and mistreatment to survive even with proper food and medical care. A British soldier who entered Bergen-Belsen recorded his initial reaction. "Nothing could have prepared us for what we found. It was beyond comprehension. It was beyond anything that could be photographed or described or even imagined. The horror was so complete, so total, that your mind refused to accept it as reality." Bergen-Belsen became the first camp where the world at large could see the conditions for themselves. Newsreel cameras and photographers entered the camp in the days after liberation. Photographs of the mass graves and the skeletal survivors were published in newspapers around the world. For the first time, the general public, people in America, Britain, and elsewhere, could see visual evidence of what the concentration camps actually were. The impact was profound and immediate. This was not abstract information, not second-hand accounts, not denied or debated claims. This was photographic evidence. This was film footage. The world could see the bodies. The world could see the survivors. The world could see the crematoria. And the world could no longer deny what had been happening. But the discovery of Bergen-Belsen also raised urgent questions that would preoccupy military commanders, medical personnel, and politicians for weeks to come. How do you help people who have been starved to the point of near death? How do you treat typhus on a massive scale when you don't even have adequate supplies? How do you process and care for thousands of traumatized survivors who have lost their families, their homes, their entire lives? The British established a hospital camp and brought in medical personnel from across the military and civilian populations. They worked around the clock to try to save the survivors, but many of them died anyway. The trauma had been too complete, the damage too profound. Bergen-Belsen became not just a symbol of Nazi cruelty, but a stark reminder that even liberation could not undo all the damage that had been done. The prisoners had been murdered by the Nazis, but in a very real sense, Bergen-Belsen continued to kill even after the liberation. The camp had created a wound that would not fully heal, even with the best medical care and the most compassionate attention. As more camps were discovered and as more soldiers encountered the evidence of Nazi atrocities, a pattern began to emerge that shocked everyone who learned about it. The concentration camps were not isolated incidents or the result of individual cruelty or the excesses of local commanders. They were part of a systematic, organized, deliberately calculated plan that had been designed and implemented from the highest levels of Nazi leadership. The camps operated according to detailed procedures. There were regulations for how many prisoners should be held, how much food should be provided, which amounted to a deliberate starvation diet, and how prisoners should be treated. There were organizational charts showing chains of command. There were detailed records kept in German bureaucratic style of exactly how many prisoners had been murdered, exactly how they had been murdered, and exactly what had been done with their remains. American and British intelligence officers who accompanied the liberating forces began collecting evidence. They photographed the camps, they interviewed survivors, they collected Nazi documents that had not been destroyed. They documented the existence of gas chambers, crematoria, and other instruments of mass murder. They found evidence of medical experimentation on prisoners. They found evidence of systematic torture. They found evidence of a regime that had deliberately, methodically, and with complete premeditation, built a system designed to murder millions of people. One crucial finding emerged again and again. This system could not have functioned without the participation of thousands of people. It required guards, administrators, doctors, engineers, and workers at multiple levels. It required the rail system that transported prisoners. It required the factories that produced the materials used to kill. It required accountants and bureaucrats who kept records and managed resources. The concentration camp system was not the work of a few fanatics or sadists. It was a functioning system of the Nazi state, with the knowledge and participation of thousands of people. This realization had enormous implications for how the war would end and how the world would respond to Nazi atrocities. It was not enough to capture or kill Hitler and his immediate circle of advisors. The entire Nazi leadership structure, and indeed large portions of German society, would have to be held accountable. The evidence gathered by Allied forces as they liberated the camps would become the foundation for the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi leaders would be tried for war crimes and crimes against humanity. But the evidence also raised questions that would haunt the world for decades to come. How could a civilized, educated, sophisticated society have descended into this? How could professors and doctors and lawyers and engineers have participated in this system? How could a nation with a rich cultural and intellectual tradition have become capable of industrial-scale murder? These questions would become central to how the world understood the Holocaust and how the world would attempt to prevent such atrocities from happening again. The machinery of death itself became a subject of intense study. The gas chambers, the crematoria, the gas vans that had been used when the camp's ovens couldn't keep up with the pace of murder. The trucks where exhaust fumes had been piped into sealed compartments containing prisoners who were then driven to burial sites and dumped into mass graves. Every detail was documented. Every mechanism was examined. The Allies wanted to understand exactly how the Nazis had managed to kill so many people so efficiently. They wanted to know what decisions had been made, what technology had been employed, what logistics had been required. This obsessive documentation was not motivated by curiosity alone. It was motivated by the need to have irrefutable evidence, evidence that could not be denied or explained away by future generations. As the camps were liberated, thousands of survivors emerged, traumatized, starved, ill, and often having lost everything and everyone they loved. These survivors bore witness to what had happened. They could describe the gas chambers from the inside. They could describe the selections at the railroad ramp where prisoners were divided, some to the gas chambers, some to the labor camp. They could describe the daily struggle to survive in an environment designed to kill them. They could describe watching family members and friends be murdered. They could describe the experiments, the torture, the casual cruelty that had characterized every moment of their captivity. But the survivors also faced a profound problem. They had survived, but they had no home to return to. Many of their families had been murdered. Many of their communities had been completely obliterated. In some cases, their homes had been taken by other people or destroyed. They had survived the Holocaust, but in doing so, they had lost almost everything else. Allied soldiers who encountered survivors struggled with how to respond. The soldiers provided food, medical care, and compassionate attention, but they also had to confront the reality that no amount of food or medicine could restore what had been lost. The survivors needed not just physical healing, but psychological and spiritual healing. They needed to rebuild their lives and their identities from scratch, starting with nothing. Some survivors became especially important to the investigation and documentation of what had happened. They provided testimony to military officials, to intelligence officers, and later to prosecutors preparing for the Nuremberg trials. Their accounts filled in the gaps in the documentary evidence. They could describe the daily reality of life in the camps in ways that no document could capture. They could explain the hierarchy of power, the ways that prisoners had sometimes collaborated with the guards to survive, and the moral compromises that people were forced to make in order to stay alive one more day. Some survivors had worked in administrative roles in the camps and could provide detailed explanations of how the killing machinery had functioned. Others were Jewish prisoners who had somehow survived, despite the Nazi goal of complete extermination of all European Jews. The presence of survivors fundamentally changed how the world understood the Holocaust. It was no longer possible to think of the camps as abstract historical facts. The survivors embodied the reality of what had happened. They were living proof of Nazi atrocities. They told stories. They answered questions. They confronted people with the reality that these had been real human beings who had suffered real, unimaginable suffering. And as time went on, many survivors became committed to ensuring that their experiences would not be forgotten, that future generations would understand what had happened, and that humanity would commit itself to ensuring that such atrocities would never happen again. Yet in those early days after liberation, many survivors were simply trying to survive. They were sick. They were weak. They had no resources and no clear path forward. Many of them were displaced persons who could not return to their home countries. In some cases, because their countries no longer existed or had been completely transformed by the war. In other cases, because of anti-Semitism or political hostility. The liberated prisoners faced a long, difficult journey just to regain some basic level of security and stability. By the end of May 1945, German forces had surrendered completely. The war in Europe was over. But the discovery of the concentration camps was only beginning to reshape how the world understood what the war had been about. News of the camps spread around the world through photographs, newsreels, radio reports, and detailed accounts published in newspapers and magazines. In America, in Britain, in the Soviet Union, and in other Allied nations, the general public was forced to confront what had been happening while they had been focused on the war itself. The response was one of shock, horror, and a kind of profound moral crisis. How had this been allowed to happen? How had the world stood by while millions of people were being systematically murdered? How had the information about the camps not been acted upon earlier? These questions would lead directly to the Nuremberg trials, where the leaders of Nazi Germany would be tried for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The evidence gathered by Allied forces as they liberated the camps became central to these trials. Photographs of the camps were presented to the court. Survivor testimony was heard. Nazi documents were introduced as evidence. The world watched as the defendants, some of them among the most powerful people in Nazi Germany, were forced to confront what had been done in their names and under their authority. Some of them denied knowledge of the camps. Some of them claimed they were just following orders. Some of them tried to minimize or explain away what had happened, but the evidence was overwhelming. The camps had existed. Millions had died. The Nazi regime had deliberately planned and executed a genocide on a scale never before seen in human history. The discovery of the concentration camps also forced a reckoning with how the world had known about them before liberation. In fact, the camps had not been secret. Journalists had visited some of them in the 1930s and written reports about them. International organizations had received reports about conditions in the camps. The Nazis themselves had not tried very hard to hide what was happening. They had been proud of their ability to control prisoners and eliminate enemies of the state. But the reports had been largely ignored or dismissed. The world had not wanted to believe that such things were happening. The world had not wanted to act. And by the time the Allies liberated the camps, the magnitude of what had been allowed to happen was almost incomprehensible. The survivors of the camps became the primary witnesses to history. They established the facts of what had happened. They described the conditions. They named the perpetrators. They testified to the systematic nature of the killing. Their testimonies would be recorded in archives, published in books, and passed on to future generations. In the decades that followed, survivor testimonies would become increasingly recognized as crucial historical documents, not as supplements to the documentary or physical evidence, but as irreplaceable records of what had actually happened and what it had felt like to live through it. The liberation of the concentration camps in 1945 marked the moment when the Holocaust ceased to be something that could be hidden or denied. It became an undeniable historical fact, documented in photographs and film, testified to by thousands of survivors, and acknowledged by the entire world. The world had been confronted with evidence of what humanity was capable of, not just the evil that humans could do, but the systems of evil that could be built and maintained by supposedly civilized societies. The Nazi concentration camps represented something new in human history: the use of industrial technology and bureaucratic organization in service of genocide. They represented the systematic murder of millions of people, not because of anything they had done, but simply because the Nazi regime had decided they should not exist. Yet even as the world reeled from these discoveries, even as the liberation of the camps forced a reckoning with what had been allowed to happen, there was a crucial and terrible realization that began to dawn. The camps that had been liberated by the Allies in 1945 represented only a portion of what had been built. In Eastern Europe, in territories that had fallen under Nazi control, camps designed purely for extermination, not labor camps with executions, but factories of death, had killed the majority of the Holocaust's victims. Auschwitz had murdered over 1 million people. Treblinka had murdered nearly 1 million more. Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and other death camps had been specifically designed to kill, with gas chambers and crematoria built to maximize efficiency. Many of these camps had been completely destroyed by the Nazis in an attempt to erase evidence. The Allied liberations of 1945 had revealed the scope and nature of the Holocaust, but they had come too late to save the vast majority of those who would be murdered. The concentration camps had to be liberated, yes, but the death camps, the camps specifically designed for extermination, had already completed their work. By the time the Allies liberated the camps in 1945, most of the Holocaust's victims were already dead. The moment when the first Allied soldiers encountered the concentration camps in 1945 became a turning point in how the world would understand the nature of evil, the possibilities for human cruelty, and the responsibility that nations and individuals bear to prevent such atrocities from happening again. The soldiers who entered those camps were changed forever by what they witnessed. The survivors who were liberated from those camps carried the scars and memories of their experiences for the rest of their lives. And the world, confronted with irrefutable evidence of what had been done, had to grapple with the knowledge that the Holocaust had happened and that it had been allowed to happen. In the years and decades that followed, the discovery of the concentration camps would become central to how the Holocaust was remembered, how World War II was understood, and how the world attempted to build international laws and institutions to prevent genocide and crimes against humanity from happening again. The terrifying moment when the first Allied soldiers discovered the concentration camps in 1944 and 1945 was the moment when the mask was torn away from the Nazi regime and from the true nature of what the war had been fought over. It was not just a war between different nations or different ideologies. It was a war between those who would build systems of death and those who would resist them, between those who would use technology and organization to murder millions and those who would use the same tools to try to save lives. The soldiers who entered those camps emerged transformed by what they witnessed. The survivors who were liberated emerged forever changed by what they had endured, and the world emerged with new understanding of what humans were capable of, both the evil they could do and the capacity for compassion and courage that would be required to prevent such horrors from ever happening again. In those frozen moments in January 1945, when Soviet soldiers opened the gates of Auschwitz and saw the evidence of mass murder, the world's conscience was awakened, and that awakening would reshape the world for generations to come. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So, if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth.